Also on this thing, I mean, we were used to this idea with rock stars needing to be young, but it's a huge thing in the art world that particularly maybe in the last 10 years when so many graduate students were immediately right out of art school becoming famous, and there was a big move in galleries, and there was a sense that if you did, I feel this very strongly, that if you haven't become a big name by the time you're 30, that you're really not going to have a big career in the art world, right? That I had a good friend when I came into the art world in the 80s in the East Village, who was very young and everything, and he was a great help, Joel Handorf, a wonderful artist, and he said that when he told people that he was 40 in the East Village scene, it was over. Nobody would have, like so many people wouldn't even talk to him. So I think that's very prevalent, actually. It doesn't mean that people make up their age, it's just that you are closed, certain areas are closed to you at a certain
Right,
age.
like getting into Peggy Guggenheim's show for artists under 35 in the 40s. You had to be under 35.
Yeah.
I mean, I think a larger issue here is the fact that artists make a career out of creating fiction, so that easily drifts over into creating fictions about yourself. True. And I mean, I think that this is increasingly a phenomenon of the modern world, because having a career now has to do with sort of creating a persona for yourself. And, at best, that's a partial image of who you are. A lot of the time it's a kind of preposterous concoction that you create to, fulfill the expectations of other people.
Well, you mentioned celebrity, and I think that the issue, we do live obviously in a market-driven, highly commercial, just white-hot art market culture that seems to be the headlines, but I think the insights, the sensitivities, the nuances about what's really happening, I think this is the important engaged conversation that we're having about these artists. Last night over dinner, the question came up, just bubbled up, and I think it's a fundamental question, not only about Colleen Browning, but about artists, male, female, gay, marginalized, people of color, the whole gamut of issues. And that is, the big mystery is, why would artists become eclipsed? If, in fact, their work had set a high mark, what's your sense as we sort of wander toward the end of this conversation? Why would people be eclipsed? And hopefully the work we're all doing is we're sort of excavating, we're doing the archaeological work to undig those graves. But what's your sense? Jonathan, why do you think people are eclipsed?
Well, I really don't, because I keep thinking this is on a podcast, so I'm not going to, commit myself. I'm a politician. I'm not going to say, well, it's because of this or that. And I also think that almost all those things. But I would say that going back to what Philip has done, and I think again everybody on this panel has done, is that I think we tend to think that the making of art, and you make a work of art, and it's all somehow in the artist. But one of the things we're learning here is that it has a lot to do with the viewer and the critic and the writer. And actually the art that you love and the art that you write about and the art that you might save, you're actually helping to create that passion and interest. And it's one of the things that we do. I think it's one of the most noble things we do as art historians, to save works of art. So as I keep saying, it's very, very complicated. And I would hate... I admire almost people who still have faith, as one of the people said in the film, and said, well, good art will out and everything. And that's kind of tautological, because I had so many friends who died of AIDS in the 80s. My best friend, Mark Lita, who's an artist that I'm devoted to, trying to keep people focused on his work. He died, though, when he was in his early 30s. And he hadn't become famous yet. He didn't have even the kind of connections that Colleen Browning did. So how do you keep people interested in that? He didn't have an estate with money to push his work. There's only me, right, to keep mentioning his name whenever I have a chance, right? And that might be successful. It might work for Mark Lita because he had a friend. If Van Gogh didn't have a brother named Theo, who was incredibly connected in the art world, and Van Gogh was a very connected guy. He was at the center of the French art world. it's hard to know whether Van Gogh would have made the impact that Van Gogh did. So let me say the other thing. To all of you in the audience, the worst thing that you can say to an artist, you'll say it as a joke, is say to them, "Oh, your art will only be appreciated after you're dead." Imagine, and people say this to you all the time, imagine saying it to a doctor or anybody else's profession. "Oh, well, nobody's going to go to you as a dentist until you're dead." It's really hostile and a weird thing to say to people, but people say it all the time, and it's not true, because unless you've made some kind of impact, unless Colleen Browning made an impact so that, and her friends and families made an impact for her, if you die and nobody knows about your work, there's somebody to take care of it, and it will disappear
If you don't have children, as so many artists didn't, and you don't have great executors of your estate or a great executor and someone protecting your estate, it's very likely going to end up in a dumpster and be destroyed. That really happens. But how artists get obscured, the whole system in the art world is the dealer who's looking for the latest new thing that he can sell or she to the collector who's looking for the latest new thing to buy, because let's not forget, people don't just buy art that they like. Now they see it as sort of stock certificates, investment. They're socking away money. It's sad, but they don't want something that's old-fashioned. They want the latest thing. And that they see as a kind of investment vehicle.
And that's the context of we can't escape the market-driven
And
context.
the critics are also looking to discover the latest new thing and write about that.
Henry?
I just might say that I think there's one other aspect, which is I think that artists who are great artists often have a sort of magical connection with the time in which they live. And very often that happens very young. A good example of this would be someone like George Bellows, who goes to New York and sees the toughness and bigness and roughness of New York in a way that no other artist does, and does extraordinary paintings for about 10 years. By the end of his career, while George Bellows was making good paintings, he was no longer making paintings that have that kind of magical direct connection with his time. And another example of this, frankly, would be Thomas Hart Benton. And I think there are all kinds of complicated reasons for this with Benton. Benton came out of a family where there was great turbulence between his parents, and his great decade was the 1930s, which was a very turbulent decade. You know, by the time you get to the 1950s, I think that Benton occasionally would do an extraordinary painting, but he's no longer has that kind of pure connection with a historical moment. And I think that for many painters, it's hard to reinvent yourself as the decades change. And with the greatest painters, and you could say this of people like Dürer and Rembrandt, also you can see how they start to lose their connection, the quality of their work slips, and then they find ways to reinvent themselves. But that's a very difficult thing to do, and it really takes tremendous gifts to do that.
Gail, what comment?
I'd like to make a comment, since Henry mentioned George Bellows, born in 1882, exactly the same year as Edward Hopper. They were classmates together at the New York School of Art. In 1924, when Edward Hopper finally in 24 had a first one-man show at the Wren Gallery, George Bellows bought some of his watercolors. The next year, 1925, Bellows' appendix burst and he died. That was it for George Bellows. He became Eclipse because he wasn't around anymore. Edward Hopper went on painting and living until 1967. Fortunately, Chester Dale and other collectors invested in George Bellows. He ended up, the great paintings Henry talked about, in the National Gallery. You don't get Eclipse when you're in the National Gallery and the right people have bought your work. It depends who invests in it. I think the level of collector is very important.
Okay, well, with the decades and the 19th and 20th century, our time is escaping us. I want to express our gratitude, certainly on behalf of the Southern Alleghenies Museum, here in Loretto, Pennsylvania. Our appreciation to our panelists. I want to give them a hand. Thank you, those of you who have been watching this live podcast. The story continues about Colleen Browning, her work. It is all about the work. It is about the art living on. I think, Jonathan, you're right that you were exactly on target, Jonathan, because she said, I am basically an illusionist. And your word there is very appropriate. She wrote, Colleen, very aware that her career was being eclipsed, she wrote a letter to the great feminist author Germaine Greer. And she wrote in a note in 1987 to Germaine Greer, thanking her for her diligence and her scholarship, and talked about how women's lives had been obliterated. And I think that your writing has been an splendid incentive to women today, when conditions are easier, to treat women artists more seriously. I think we've done our due diligence. We've treated Colleen Browning seriously. We thank you all for your participation. Signing off here from Southern Alleghenies Museum in Loretto, Pennsylvania. Thank you.